Hello. Can you guys hear me? Not really. Hello? Do I just need to speak louder or is that good? Okay. Hey guys, welcome to lecture. Today we're gonna finish talking about networking and then talk about something called Codable. So logistics, not much. We have our hack challenge ceremony tonight after lecture, so at 8:30 p.m. So after lecture, just sit tight and yeah, that will be happening. Going over some submissions from P5, we have Philip, Yanlam, and Gonzalo. So let's see. So Philip, this is Philip's app. He implemented all 4 challenges. So you can like filter using and or not or even XOR. And so you have like that filtering, and then he also has this search bar where you can like search for. If you type Burger King, you get Burger King. Chipotle, you have Chipotle. Hold up. I guess there's a small bug. Hold up. Let me restart this. And then he also did like the single column, 2 column toggle. So really nice job. Next we have Yan Lam. Again, very well designed. You should be a designer. So you have these items. If you tap on an item, you see like this screen with like things about the price. There's like an image. Yeah, so a lot of nice work. And then you also toggle between single and double as well. So actually, nice job. And then we have Gonzalo. Looks very similar to our Eater app, which is really nice. So if you tap on a cell, you get information again, and then there's also like a link to the website. So that's cool. And then if you go back, you have like the toggles. You can switch to 1 column versus 2 column, and then you can like I think the filtering works by like typing the name. So like cheap or expensive. So yeah, nice job. 2.3. Okay, so, let's do some review. So, for those that have Polo, can you open the app and join the group? I don't know if anyone's joining. So, which of the following is not a type of HTTP request?
What do you want me to do? Okay.
5 more seconds. Does anyone want to tell me the answer? Yeah.
Create.
Yeah, great. So the types of HTTP requests we have are get, delete, post, put. Are there other ones?
There's a lot more.
There's a lot of other ones, but create is not one of them. So yeah. And then second one, what is JSON?
Should I end it?
Yeah. Does anyone want to tell me the answer? Let me put that right. Anyone? Anyone just call this one. Do you have an answer? Yeah.
Well, I thought it was both A and C.
A and C.
So I'm guessing
Okay. Not exactly. So if you remember from last lecture, actually let me just pull up an example. So an example of JSON is like this response we have. Oh. An example of a JSON is just like this response that we have. And if you look here, all this is just a dictionary where you have key and value pairs. And then these values themselves can either be other dictionaries, an array, a string, integer, Boolean, like whatever. But like essentially, I think the best way to think about JSON is just, they're just dictionaries with key value pairs. So the answer is B. Any questions on that? Cool. So now we're gonna talk about closures. For those that didn't do the extra credit assignment, I'm gonna go over what closures are. But for those that did, you guys should already have a pretty good idea, I hope. So closures. You can think about closures as just like functions that aren't formally defined. So normally when you try to declare a function, you have to do like func, give it a name, and then declare the arguments, and then give the function body. Closures themselves are very similar to just functions, except they're not as formally defined. So like, let's look at an example. Here we defined a closure called add two numbers closure. The type is a tuple of int, comma int, and then to int. So basically what this means is you can think about it as like a function that has two arguments, both of which are of type int, and then this closure returns a value of type int. So if you look at the function body, we have first, second, and then in the function of the closure, we have return first plus second. So right after that, we do let closure 3 equals add two numbers closure 1, 2. Because does anyone want to guess what closure 3 is equal to? Yeah. Yeah, 3. Do you want to explain how you got that?
Because 1 and 2 are basically the arguments, and then they go into the first and second variable, and then you just return them added together.
Yeah, so closures are, like I said, very similar to functions. So when I do add two numbers closure 1, 2, all that does is you're essentially passing in 1 for first and 2 for second, and then you run whatever's in the body, and then you get whatever comes out. So in this case, you return 1 plus 2, which is just 3. So closure 3 has type int. So that's like an example of a closure. Where do we see it in our applications? Well, there are actually a lot of built-in functions that use closures. So for example, arrays have built-in functions called map, filter, and sort. I'm not going to go over all of them, but here's like an example of map. So map is essentially used to get from an array of type A to an array of type B. So if you look at the screenshot, list is an array of integers, and then on the next line we do list.map, and then we have a closure here that takes in one argument and returns a boolean. So all this is doing is it's gonna loop through all the elements in list and then map that integer to a boolean value. So let's say we start with negative 23. We plug in negative 23 for num, and then we see that negative 23 is not greater than or equal to 0, so negative 23 gets mapped to false. And the same thing for 10. 10 is greater than or equal to 0, so that is mapped to true. And then 4 is true, 123 is true, negative 5 is false. So now map has allowed you to go from an array of integers to an array of booleans. So that's like another use case for closures. What does that have to do with networking? Well, if you remember from last lecture, we had this function called getClauses, and essentially all we did in here was we made a request to some endpoint using the get HTTP method, and then we had this like block called response in, and then some like code in between, and this is a closure, right? So response is your argument, and then you have your closure function body, right there. So like it's like the switch and then the case. So like what exactly is the reasoning for having a closure? Well, if you think about it, when you make a request to a server and wait for a response, that like takes time, right? Whether it be like 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, it takes like, there's like some delay. What you don't want is for your application to hit this line and then wait until you get a response to do anything else. because then your application will be very slow and like very unresponsive. So what happens is when your application hits the animal fire.request line, it makes the request, but then right after that, it just moves on and runs whatever code is next. Only when we get a response does this closure get called. So in this case, closures are used to trigger some block of code after some event. In this case, the event is when the server has returned a response to us. Any questions about anything so far? Cool. So also, if you notice, this function has an argument called completion, and completion itself is of type closure. Essentially, it just takes in one argument of type course arrays and then returns void, so it has no return type. So the reason we have this is because, so let's say we make a request to the server, we get some JSON response. So let's like assume we got this response. We want to then somehow convert this information into an array of course objects that we can use in our application, and then have those use those array of course objects to maybe like update our table view, or just or like run any other sort of code. The way we would do that is by passing in a closure through this like completion argument. And there's also this @escaping keyword. The reason we need to have that is because, like I mentioned, when your application calls this function, what's going to happen is it's going to make the request to the endpoint, but then it's then just going to continue and exit the function. Only when we get the response does the closure get called. And because our completion, we call like completion courses inside the closure, completion is going to be called after the function get classes is completed. So like we call get classes, we make the request, we exit the function, but then when we get the response, we come back into the function, into the closure, and then we call completion. So because completion is being called after the function returns, you have to mark it with the @escaping keyword. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's like just an overview for closures. We're going to be using that today in our demo. Now just to go over like networking. So what's the point of having networking? So like so far for all your projects, you guys have just been like hard coding data. So like for example, for the project 5, you like hard coded all the eateries and all the information. But like obviously if you're trying to make like apps that like scale, you can't possibly like hard code everything, right? So instead what we do is we write the code for networking that does several things. It can either like retrieve data, update data, delete data, or add data. So like some examples, let's say you have a social media app, and when you open the app, you want to get all the posts in the feed. What you would do is make like a get request for all the feed information and then display that. Or maybe like you want to send data. So like when you log in a user, you have to send the user's email, username and password to the server, and then the server checks if that information is correct. If it's correct, then the server lets the client know, and the client allows the user to sign in. Another example is like maybe like on Spotify, if you delete a song from a playlist, next time you open your application, the song shouldn't be there anymore, right? So what happens there is you just make a delete request to some server, and then it gets deleted from like the database. And so I know networking might sound like kind of complicated, but like essentially it's like basically just this diagram. So you have a client, in this case it's like our application, it makes some requests to a server, so that's like the backend, and then the server returns some response, and then after that you can like decide to do whatever you want with the response. But essentially all networking is just like this two-step process. You make a request and then you get a response. Any questions? Oh, also as a side note, I know in our hack challenge proposal, we mentioned like the term API, and I know some people may not have heard of that before. API just stands for Application Programming Interface, and all it is like you can think of it as like a menu that essentially tells you, it lists all the operations that allow your application to interact with another application. So like for example, there's a Google Calendars API, and that essentially just like lists all the HTTP methods that your application can make to interact with the Google Calendar server. So like for example, if you wanted, you can make an application where you would allow a user to add an event onto their Google Calendar from your application. So it's just like some way for your application to interact with another server or another application. So that's like networking. To finish off networking, we're gonna go over decoding server responses. So I believe this is where we left off last lecture. We just made a request to an endpoint, and then we got a response, and then we print out the JSON. So like that's awesome and all, but now that we have the JSON, we have to actually convert it into something that we can use inside our application, and that's what decoding is for. So this is our response, and we want to convert our JSON or decode it into model objects that we make that we define in our application. So how do we decode this JSON into an array of courses? Because like essentially, if you look at this JSON, it really just represents an array of courses, right? Where each course has like a name, a code, instructor, enrolled. How do we decode it? Well, let's look at like a simpler example. If our response wasn't like this big mess, it was just like this simple JSON where we have a name, code, instructor, and enrolled. All we would have to do to go from this JSON to a course object is by making our model object conform to Codable. So in this case, you see course now conforms to Codable. And one thing to notice, oh yeah, that's in the next slide, never mind. But after you conform it to Codable, all you have to do is use a JSON decoder, which I'll show you guys later, to convert the JSON into a course object. And one thing to notice is that the variable names and the key names match exactly. So if you look at name's value is a string, intro to iOS development. Similarly, in our course object, you have a variable name and its value is string. And then similar for code, the value of code is an integer because it's 1998. Instructor is string, enrolled is Boolean. You have to match it exactly, or else the JSON decoder will not be able to properly assign the values from the JSON into your course object. Any questions? Cool. Now we can move on to the demo. So pull up the Lecture 7 starter code. And then let's just run this application. So right now it's empty because we haven't made any requests to the server. So let's just go back into our network manager file, and then we're gonna make a request to the endpoint again. So remember what we did last time? We just did Alamofire. So Alamofire, if you guys remember, is just a CocoaPod that we use to do networking. So like in order to make HTTP requests. So we do Alamofire.request, and then for URL, we're gonna use endpoint. And then the method is going to be get. So what this means is we're making a get request to this endpoint. And then we also have to do .validate. What doing .validate does is it makes sure that the response that we get is actually a valid response. And then if you do .response, you can see a lot of different ones. The one we used last lecture was response JSON, and what that does is it converts the response into a JSON object for you to use. I'm gonna use response data. So what that does is just converts the response into a data object. So press enter, and then you can press enter again. For the argument, we're gonna call it response, and then you can switch on the response.result to see if the response succeeded or not. So you have .success. Oh, case.success. And then we're going to call that data. Otherwise, it fails, and then we have the error. So in case it fails, let's just print the error description. And then if it succeeds, I guess we can print the data. If you guys are using this and you still want to see the JSON, one thing you guys can do is convert it back to JSON. So you can convert back to JSON by doing let JSON equals JSON serialization dot JSON object with data options JSON serialization dot reading options. So here the data is just your data, and then options is dot allow fragments, and we're actually gonna get an error, I believe. Yeah. So calling the function actually can throw an error. So what you have to do is mark it with a try block, and then since this is optional, we need to unwrap it. So let's just unwrap it inside the if let, and then here we can call print JSON. So to see what's happening here, let's actually call it in our application. So go back to your view controller file, and then inside this get classes, we're just gonna call that function from network manager. So network manager dot get classes, and then here it expects a closure, which is just like a function. So to do that, you can just press enter. Here you're gonna give a name for the variable that's gonna represent the array of courses. So here you can just call it courses, and then here I'm just gonna print to do. But I just want to be able to call the application. And then let's add a breakpoint actually here, here, here. So let's run it, and then let's see what we get. So we run our application. We hit view did load, and then we call get classes. Get classes then calls network manager.get classes, and then we hit this line. And then if you see, if I press next line, what it does is it goes all the way to the end, because like I mentioned, the closure doesn't get called until we actually get a response. So after it makes a request, it just keeps on going. And then after we get a response, we come back into the closure, and then we can like handle it. So let's just see where it goes. It succeeds, and then it prints a JSON. So here is our JSON object. So if you guys are using this and you still want to see the JSON, you guys can see it like this. So now we're gonna have to make, actually before we do anything else, we're gonna have to make some extra structs. So remember from this slide, the way we decode JSON is by making classes that conform to Codable and whose variables sort of like map to the JSON response, right? So like for this, all we need would be the course struct, but because this response is a bit more complicated, we're gonna have to create more struct for that. So let's look at the response first. I think the best way to do this is like go inside out. So first we have a course object. So we need a struct representing a course, which we already have. So we just have to make this conform to Codable. So we don't have to change anything else there. Next, if you think about like going up one level, you have this array. You have this like classes key, and then its value is an array of courses, right? So we have to make a struct to represent this. So let's call it course data. We're gonna make it conform to Codable as well. And then because it has a key called classes, we have to make a variable called classes. And the type of classes is just gonna be an array of courses, because classes is mapped to an array of courses. So classes and then an array of courses. Does that make sense? Cool. And then now, so we're here. If we go up one more level, we sort of like reach this, where we have an object, and you have a key called data, and then data is mapped to essentially a course data object, right? Because course data is an object with key classes. So what we're gonna want to do is make a struct that has a variable called data. So let's call it like course response. This is also gonna conform to Codable. And then we're going to make a variable called data. And the type of data is going to be an object that has a variable called classes, which is just course data. So if you think about it, like this sort of like goes from top down. At the very top, we have an object with one key, data. So that's like this data object. Data is mapped to a course data object. And course data has a key called classes, which maps to this variable called classes. And classes is mapped to an array of courses, which is just an array of courses here. So you're sort of just essentially like copying over the JSON format over into your application. Cool. And then now we can go back to our network manager file. The first thing we're going to want to do is make a decoder. So you can do let decoder equals JSON decoder. And what this is going to do is it's gonna help us convert our data, so this data, into some like Swift model object that we created. So what we can do is we can do let course response. So we're gonna convert data into a course response object. So let course response equals decoder dot decode, and then here you can see that it takes in some Codable class and then some data. Because we want to decode it into a course response object, we do course response dot self, and then data, you just do data, and then it should complain again, I think. Yeah, so this function also could throw an error, so you guys have to match it with a try statement, and then because this is optional, we have to unwrap it. So let's wrap it in the if let, and then if it succeeds, let's sort of print the courses. So this is a course response object. It has a data field. Data has a classes field. So let's just print that and then see if it works. So let's just run it again. So we hit network manager.get classes. We call it, and then it leaves the function. And then once we get a response, we come back in here. It succeeds, we print the JSON, we make a decoder, and then we try decoding it, and then it succeeded. So let's see what classes is. So here you see that course response.data classes is an array of courses, where, like, for example, the first element has name equal to intro to iOS development, code 1998, instructor Kevin and Mindy, which is essentially what we have here. So now we've actually decoded the JSON into objects that we made ourselves. So what we can do now is, actually, now that we have this array of courses, we can call our closure with the updated array of courses. So to do that, you just do, it's like similar to calling a function. You do completion, and you pass in the argument, and then in this case, it's just your array of courses, which is this. And then let's go back in view controller. I'm going to add a breakpoint. So let's run this again and see what happens. So we hit this line, we go into network manager, we make the request, we get a response, and then we get to this line, and then we call to completion. Remember, the completion is just argument that we passed in here, and that argument, that closure, is this closure. So what should happen now is when we call completion course response.data.classes, is that should call this closure, where courses is now that updated array of courses. So if we go to the next line, you can see that it comes into this block. So now we have the array of courses. We have access to the array of courses that we got from the server. So what we want to do here is, if you look at the table view code, the table view code is using this array called courses to display cells. So all we need to do is just update that array of courses with our courses that we got from the server. So we can just do self.courses equals courses, and then after we update the courses array, we have to call table view.reload data. And before we run this, there's actually one more like line of code you guys need. So it's gonna be dispatch queue.main.async. So I'll sort of explain what this does. So when you make a network request here, and then you get a response, this response is run. So actually, there's like two types of. Has anyone heard of threads? Yeah, if you haven't taken iOS, you probably haven't learned of threads. But essentially, you can think about it as like your application has multiple threads, and threads are sort of like where code is run, and you have a main thread and a background thread. Any code on the main thread is sort of run like immediately, whereas any code on the background thread is run like maybe like a couple seconds later. When you get a response, all this code is run on the background thread. So when it calls the completion block, so this closure, this code is being run on the background thread, but we want our table view to update immediately, right? So in order for our table view to update immediately, you have to somehow get that code onto the main thread. And the way you do that is just by calling dispatch queue.main.async. Any code that you put in here will be run on the main thread. So the reason that you guys need this is so that your UI updates immediately. So I'm just gonna run this again. Same thing, you hit the request, you get the completion, you call the completion, and then we update courses, then we call table view.reload data. So now you guys should see all the cells shown up with all the course data. Does everyone see that on their laptops for those that are following along? Okay, cool. Does anyone have any questions about that whole process? Okay, so next thing we're gonna do isn't really related to this application. So I found this like fake API. So if you go in here, this is like just a place where you can like make requests and you get like a response. We're gonna be making a post request to this API/login endpoint, and essentially remember post requests take in parameters. So in this case, the parameter is a dictionary where you have an email key and the password key, and then you pass in a email and password that is of type string. And then as a response, you should get some information about a user. So you get information about like a user's token, for example. So we're going to be making a request to this. Before we do that, let's sort of make the actual struct to represent this response. So we're going to make a new file called user. And then here we're just going to define a model called user. It's going to conform to Codable. We're going to be using this user object to decode this response. Does anyone want to tell me what variable I should have here for user if we want to decode this response? Token, yeah. Because the key is token, you just want a variable called token. And then what is the type going to be? String, yeah, because this is of type string. So var token string. Cool. So let's go into a network manager file. We're going to be doing it in this login function. So this login function takes in the email and the password as arguments. So first thing we need to do is create our parameters. So parameters themselves are just dictionary, so it's of type string to any. So let's do less parameters equals, and then in here we have to define the parameters. So here it says you need an email and the password. So you have email, and the value is just going to be this email that we pass in, and then password, and then the value is going to be this password that we pass in. So that's the parameters. And then now we're going to make the actual request. So you have to do animalifier.request. This time we're going to use this really long one. .request URL method parameters encoding. So press enter. For URL, we're going to use the post endpoint. So post endpoint. The method is going to be post. Parameters is going to be our parameters that we defined. For encoding, you're going to want URL encoding.default. And then for headers, you don't have any, so you can just put nil. So all this is doing is we're making a post request to this endpoint using these parameters. And then we can do the same thing, .validate.response data. And then we have this completion handler again. Press enter, you can assign this to response, and then we can switch on the response or result again. So if it succeeds, we have a data object, If it fails, we have an error object. So if it fails, let's print the description again. And then here, let's sort of convert this data into JSON again, just to make sure our JSON is getting returned properly. So remember, it's just let JSON equal JSON serialization dot JSON object with data and then options. Data is just going to be this data. Options is dot allow fragments. And then because this throws, you have to add a try keyword, and then since this is optional, we want to unwrap it. So let's unwrap it like that, and then print the JSON. So basically what we did over here. So before we can test that, we actually have to call the function. So go back to a view controller. Let's make a function called login. Actually, yeah, let's make a function called login. It's going to take in an email, a password, and then inside here we just call the network manager.login, and we pass in the email and password. And then we want to call the function inside our view.load. So login, and then email, we can do my email, and then password, let's just do password. So let's add some breakpoints to see what happens. So we're gonna call this, and then we go in here and then go in here. All right, so now let's run this. So we call login with the email and password. We set up the parameters, and then we make a post request to this endpoint. And then when we get a response, the closure gets called. And then let's see if it succeeds. It does. And then we print the JSON. So JSON, as expected, is just a JSON with one key token and then the actual token. So now to decode this into a user object, we can just do the same thing. We first make a decoder. So let decoder equals JSON decoder. And then now we want to decode our data into a user object, right? So we can do let user equals decoder dot decode, and then type from data. So type is going to be user because we want to decode it into a user object. Data is going to be data again. And then because this throws an error, you have to add a try. And then because this is optional, we want to unwrap it with a if let. And then let's print the user. Let's run that again. So login, request, we get the response. We print the JSON, and then we try to decode it, and then it succeeded. So let's print the user. So user, you see, is just an user object whose token is QPWL5, whatever. So it actually succeeded in decoding it. So the last thing we want to do is actually add a completion argument here. So it's sort of similar to what we did here. We're going to make an argument called completion. This is going to be of type closure. So we're going to add an escaping keyword, and then this closure is going to take in a user object and then return nothing. So the argument is going to be user, and then there's not going to be a return type. So let's just do return void. And then here we can just pass the user into the completion. And then because we changed this definition, we have to go back in here. .login email, password, and then the completion, we have to define it. So here we have to define a variable name for the user object. Let's call that user. And then let's just like print user with token user.token logged in. So let's see if that works. So we hit login, make the request, get back a response. We try to decode into user, it succeeds, and then we call completion passing in that user object. So then that goes into this closure, which we passed in, and then we call the print statement. So here you have the print statement and everything works, so that's good. So you see here, the point of having a closure is after we get a response from the server and then decode it, if we wanted to do something with the user object inside the view controller file, we could do it inside this closure block. So that's why you would have a closure for your networking code. Any questions about making post requests? Okay, cool. And then one last thing we're gonna do is, so I found a different API called random.dog, and if you go to it, you get a JSON that has key URL, and then if you go copy and paste this URL into a different tab, you should see a dog. So we're gonna try to make something that constantly displays dog images. So let's do that inside here. So first thing we're gonna want to do is make a struct to decode this response. So let's go back and, can you guys see that? So let's go back and make a new file. We're gonna call it dog. So dog is gonna be conforming to Codable. And then what variable do I need for dog in order to decode this? Yeah, URL. So URL, and then what's the type? String. Yeah. So we have key URL, so we call our variable URL, and then URL has a value of this string here, so the type of URL should be string. So now we can go back into Network Manager, and then inside getRandomDog, we can do animalfire.request, and then this time we're just making a get request, so we're going to do .request dog endpoint. Method is going to be .get, and then same thing, .validate .response data. So now we make a get request is dog endpoint, and then when we get a response, we do the same thing, switch on the result. We get the data, or if it fails, we get the error. So if it fails, let's print the description. Otherwise, I'm not gonna convert it to JSON because we've done it a couple times already. So I'm just gonna go straight to decoding it. So let decoder equals JSON decoder. And then we want to decode this into a dog object. So we can do let dog equals decoder dot decode. And then for type, it's gonna be dog because we want to decode into a dog. And then data is gonna be this data, so that's just data. And then this function throws, so you have to add a try keyword, and then since this is optional, we want to unwrap it, so wrap that in the if let, and then let's print dog, and then let's get rid of these, and then go back into view controller, and we're gonna make a function called get random dog, and then all this is gonna do is called network manager .get random dog. And then we have to call the function inside our view.load. So let's add some breakpoints, and then let's run it. So we hit this line, we make a request, we get a response, and then we try to decode it, and then we get the dog object, and then you see here, dog is now an object with URL of this link. So now we have access to the image URL, but like this URL is just a string, right? What we want is a UI image object. So the way we get from the way we go from this string into a UI image object is by making another request to this this like URL. So basically, when you make a request to this URL, the data you get back, the data you get back is data about the image. So what we want to do is make a request to this dog URL, and then go from that data into a UI image. So let's actually let's add the completion first. So at the end, we want to pass back a UI image object. So we're gonna make the argument UI image, and then it's not gonna have a return type, so void. So now we're gonna call this function down here called fetch dog image. So fetch dog image takes in the image URL, which in this case is the dog URL, and then the completion is just our completion right here. So now we have to fill in this function. So here it's going to be very similar to what we had before. I actually might just copy this. So here we're going to make a request to image URL. And then here we're not going to decode it actually. So after we make a get request to this image URL, the data we get back is data about the image. And if you look at the constructor for UI image, there's one that takes in data as an argument, so right here. So all we have to do to convert this image data into a UI image is just pass in data. And then since this is optional, let's unwrap it. And then we can finally call completion and then pass in the dog image. So let's sort of see what happens now. Actually, we have to add the completion here. So when we get the random dog, and then we get back an image, I actually added like a dog image view right here. So all we want to do when we get an image is set the dog image view dot image to be dog image. And then again, since we want this to happen immediately, we have to run it on the main thread. So we do dispatch queue dot main dot async, and then we pass this into there. Oh, you have to add self. Okay. So let's run that. So we call get random dog. It goes in here. And then we call fetch dog image. And then fetch dog image makes the request. We come back. And then we try to convert it into a UI image. It succeeds. And then we call it completion, which when we pass it in, it's just this block. So it comes back to this block. And then we update the image view.image to be the dog image. So we run this. You see the dog image. So now we have a dog image. And then one last thing is, let's make it so that we get a new dog every like 3 seconds. So one thing you guys can do is inside view.load, we're gonna make a timer. So let timer equals timer. And then we're gonna want schedule timer, time interval, target selector, user info, and repeats. So time interval is just the time you want, the number of seconds you want this to be called. So let's just do 3 seconds. Target is gonna be self. Selector is gonna be the function that gets called every 3 seconds. So in this case, we want to call get random dog every 3 seconds. So get random dog. User info is nil, and the repeats we set to true, which just means that this is gonna run infinitely. And then after we call the timer, after we make the timer, we have to fire it in order for it to start. And then if we run this, let's see what happens. So we get a dog image, and then we get another one. And then okay, I'm not sure how that happened. But now, yeah, so now you're just going to get dog images forever. Yeah, any questions about any of that? So that's like how you would, if for the hack challenge you want to somehow like involve images, this is how you would like decode images. Cool. And then I think that's almost it. So we know that you guys have the hack challenge starting this week, but we still have one project. We shortened it down a lot. So like the only thing, all the UI code is given to you. The only thing you guys have to do is like 5 to-dos, which is just the networking code. So that's going to be due next Sunday. It shouldn't take you guys that long because all the UI code is done. So all you're going to be doing is writing the networking code. And then we're also starting the hack challenge in like 10 minutes. So you can just stay in your seats.